Good afternoon and welcome to the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington's webinar, Welcoming and Engaging Jews of Color. I am Rabbi Abbi Sharofsky, Director of Intergroup Relations and JCRC Rabbi in Residence. Today's program is part of a larger conversation about race and racial justice. JCRC of Greater Washington has a history of involvement in racial justice issues. History involvement in issues of racial justice, including advocacy on issues that impact Black and Brown communities and a deeply rooted commitment to equity. These past months have pushed those efforts into the spotlight as we share public statements of solidarity with the Black community following the murder of George Floyd and continue to raise our voice about issues of educational equity, housing rights, policing, and criminal justice reform. JCRC developed Listen, Learn, Act, a toolkit of anti-racist resources, producing a comprehensive and ever-growing site for learning. We are building and strengthening relationships with our interfaith and intergroup partners throughout Greater Washington. Today, we look within the Jewish community. Our Jewish community is not monolithic, not in our beliefs and practices, our affiliations, or our appearance. We are here to learn how to do better. Jewish spaces must be places where all Jews, no matter the color of their skin and their family or community of origin, feel welcome and safe. This is not easy work. Each person here today is at a different point in that process. Perhaps this is your first time in this conversation. Perhaps it is your 100th. It is important that you are here, that you are in the conversation, willing to do this work as uncomfortable as it may feel at times. Ask questions, follow up with me after the program. There is so much to learn and we are here to teach. It is my pleasure to welcome JCRC board member and co-chair of our Intergroup Relations Commission, Marla Schulman, to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Abby, and thank you for putting this together today. Like Abby said, I'm the co-chair of JCRC's Intergroup Relations Commission along with Tal Wittes, and it's my honor to introduce our speakers today, Tema Smith and Kelly Whitehead. Tema Smith is a diversity advocate, writer, and Jewish community builder. She is currently the Director of Professional Development at 18 Doors, formerly Interfaith Family, an organization that empowers people in interfaith relationships to engage in Jewish life and make Jewish choices, and encourages Jewish communities to welcome them. This comes after 7 years as a synagogue professional, most recently as the Director of Community Engagement at Holy Blossom Temple, Toronto's oldest synagogue. Tema is also a contributing columnist at The Forward, whose writing has been published in My Jewish Learning, The Globe and Mail, and the Canadian Jewish News. Tema is dedicated to building a meaningful and inclusive Jewish community through research, training, writing, and relational engagement work. Kelly Whitehead is a rabbinical student at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Kelly grew up in New York City before moving to Washington, D.C., where she graduated from American University. Prior to rabbinical school, Kelly worked as the youth engagement specialist at Washington, D.C.'s Temple Sinai in a shared position with URJ Camp Harlem. Kelly's love of the Jewish community formed during her summers working with high schoolers at camp and throughout her involvement in the Union for Reform Judaism's Juvenation Fellowship Jews of Color cohort. Thank you both for being here with us today, and Tema, we'll start with you.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. I'm just so encouraged with how many people are choosing to come and learn and be with us as we navigate a tricky topic and challenging times. So I just want to start with a little bit of context for what we are doing here together today. So just a little bit about me to sort of contextualize where I come from in this conversation. I am a mixed race individual. My mother is white Ashkenazi Jewish from Toronto. My father is Black from New York City. I grew up in Toronto, very far outside of the organized Jewish community for a number of reasons. One, and you've probably kind of guessed that I have a passion for working with interfaith couples and families based on the work that I do. But we were an interfaith family in the 80s at a time where that was nowhere near as common as it is now. But I think more significantly, we were an interracial family. And Toronto's Jewish community is still quite small c conservative in its sort of makeup and observances. And we were definitely an outlier. And so we didn't really have formal Jewish education growing up. For some reason that my mother and I still joke around, we don't fully understand. I was always drawn to wanting to know more and learn more and observe more, and ended up studying in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University as part of my grad school, and moved back and became a Jewish communal professional within a year after that. So that's sort of been my path, but a lot of what has motivated me in my career has been trying to create spaces for people like me, spaces for people who don't see themselves reflected and don't know whether their families will be safe and comfortable in the spaces in our community in which they walk. So a little bit of context when we talk about Jews, race, and Jews of color. What we're talking about, so Jews of color is a relatively recent term. It's really popped up in the last, say, 15 or so years. And it was a term that was developed by a number of racially diverse Jews, looking for some sort of an umbrella term to describe their experiences that also incorporated their experience as being racialized individuals in the US predominantly. And the term kind of caught on. So what it includes, of course, there's Black Jews who are included in this. There are Indigenous Jews, there are Asian Jews, and most interestingly, some Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews do consider themselves to be part of the JOC community, and others do not. And so really it is a self-assignation of a group of people who have a particular experience of race, and people who don't necessarily feel that that is true to their experience, don't necessarily take on that term for themselves. So it's a very broad category, but a lot of what we are talking about now when we talk about Jews of color are Jews who have experiences of being sort of racialized groups, and racialized being the term that I prefer to people of color in general, where it's a group of people who have sort of all of the social construct of being part of a particular non-white race. And so it's come to sort of mean that. And it really is a way to describe the experiences that are different than the experience of, say, my mother, who of course grew up in Toronto in a very sort of Christian upper middle class neighborhood, being a poor immigrant Jewish family, and facing like horrendous anti-Semitism, but didn't face the same sorts of racism that, say, for example, my father growing up as a Black man in America faced. And so it doesn't erase, this is I think really important, the idea of Jews and whiteness or anything like that does not actually erase anti-Semitism. It just acknowledges that people who are Jews of color might experience different kinds of racism alongside that anti-Semitism that we as a Jewish people all experience. So where's the Jewish community now compared to where it was? Well, I gave you a little bit of context to where I was as a child. And when I got involved in the Jewish community after moving home from Jerusalem, I searched the internet looking for organizations that worked with Jews of color, and I came up with two. There were more, I just didn't find them, but it was still very nascent. And this is, we're talking about, I moved back to Toronto in 2008. So 2008, 2009, this was not a hot button topic. The organizations that were doing the work largely were not doing advocacy so much as they were providing spaces for Jews of color to get together with each other and see people in Jewish contexts who look like them. We've come a long way in the 12 years since then, where, you know, I think fondly back to the biennial, the URJ biennial in December, where many of the sort of key topics on stage during the plenaries were about anti-Black racism, were about moving our communities towards further inclusion. And when I look at the number of people who've chosen to be here today, I continue to be excited and impressed at how much progress we have made. So really what that means to me is that there's a huge growing awareness of the ways in which racism play themselves out in the community, in the Jewish community. One of my colleagues and friends, Alana Kaufman, who runs the Jews of Color Initiative, put it, I think, in a way that I can't even come up with a better sort of metaphor for. She said, you know, it's not like the Jewish community is in some hermetically sealed Ziploc bag that doesn't absorb the environment around us. We live in racist countries. I'm in Canada, but I also spend most of my time in, well, until our borders closed, I spent probably 50% of my time south of the border, and I am a dual citizen, and a lot of my life, and especially my Jewish life, is south of the border. So it's not as if we are sort of sealed off from the ambient racism of the societies that we live in. And Canada has its own problems. Don't let anyone tell you that Canada is a perfect place. So we have our own problems here. We absorb the cultures that we live in. And, you know, my mom wrote an article early on after George Floyd's murder about the differences between the anti-Black racism that she sort of got a front row seat to, marrying a Black man and having kids with him, versus her experiences of anti-Semitism. Her name's Chana Verbi, and I totally encourage you to look it up. It was a painful read. I learned things that she had protected me from, and it was a very painful read in the foreword. And, you know, just understanding that. The last thing that I just want to draw on before I throw it over to Kelly is some of the ways in which the conversation some of the ways in which the conversation has been moving in the last sort of, yes, I will put my mother's name in the chat. It's the only thing that she wrote for the foreword, so if you Google her, okay, threw it into the chat. I don't have a link to the article, but if you Google Chana Verbi and foreword, you will find it. Yes, so just over the last number of months, the ways in which the conversation has sort of shifted into a new phase, I think. So, you know, everyone talks about George Floyd's murder as being sort of this racial awakening. I actually backdated a week in the Jewish community to when an article that was an excerpt of the American Jewish Yearbook was published on eJewish Philanthropy, talking about how many Jews of color are there in the United States. And it was really looking at the Jews of Color Initiative a year prior had put out a study trying to sort of extrapolate based on the inconsistency that has been in most of our communal studies of trying to figure out how many Jews of color there are. And most notably, what the Jews of Color Initiative identified was we have all these communal studies that come out through federations and things like that across the country, and very often race is not asked. And so what does that mean when we're trying to figure it out? So they extrapolated, and I am not a numbers person. I will not pretend to be a numbers person. I read the methodological appendix. I don't understand it. Humanities major through and through. But they sort of extrapolated and came up with a number of 12 to 15% of the American Jewish community are Jews of color. So the authors of this American Jewish Yearbook chapter were the authors of a number of Jewish communal surveys that excluded the race question. And they came at it and wanted to sort of look over what had been done and then come up with their own number to sort of cross-reference. And they came up with a number of about 5%, 5 to 6%, I believe. So at the sort of low end of the estimate, it was half the number of Jews of color. And it turned into, so again, not a numbers person. They may very well be correct. And I want to make sure that I say that. I don't know. And the reality is none of us know because the questions haven't been asked in a way that we can find out. So they came up with this, but the issues that sort of came through in the article were misunderstandings of who Jews of color are, you know, clumsy language like people of color who choose to identify as Jews, sort of assumptions that all Jews of color come from interfaith families, the ones who are born Jewish come from interfaith families, and just a number of sort of subtle issues throughout the article. And the Jewish community, the organized Jewish community, for the most part, went nuts. There were article after article in the foreword. I wrote one. Mine was probably the most polite of, Canadian joke, most polite of the other articles that were published. Rabbi Rick Jacobs wrote a scathing rebuke of the authors, outright calling them racist outright. And it was really remarkable to watch this sort of academic discussion transform into this sort of argument about how we are treating Jews of color in the US. I'm just looking at the Q&A. So yes, that is the article that I referenced. Somebody asked, there's a link, and I don't know if I can. Oh, I guess if I say answer live, you should all be able to see the question now. Okay, great. And when I was in Israel, I did not become acquainted with the Ethiopian community. So there's a question here. When I was in Israel, did I become acquainted with the Ethiopian community? A wonderful addition to the Jews of Israel, but who are suffering from discrimination in their own home. I did not. So I did not really, beyond going to a few Ethiopian restaurants, meet many Ethiopian Jews. For me, I will say my experience, my year in Israel was really eye-opening for me, not so much about Israel, but actually meeting American Jews from all walks of life and all political outlooks and all observances. And it was just a really meaningful year for me in my Jewish development. And also I was in grad school, and let me tell you, I spent most of my free time in the library. So I didn't get a whole lot of sort of cultural exposure in that way. Yes, so that's really it. And so, this huge conversation blew up around Jews of color, and, everyone was sort of struggling to figure out how we reconcile the need to actually find out numbers to accurately fund, and the need to sort of not dismiss outright the idea that there might be more and that our communal studies might have missed something. So all of this is happening, and then George Floyd is murdered, and protests break out. And I remember watching CNN like day and night, and just like feeling like America was in flames. Canada was still really locked down, so we didn't have huge protests here. With the COVID stuff, people are a lot more like willing to listen to the government saying to stay inside. I don't know. So we didn't have many protests. But we had some, but nothing like what happened south of the border. And really that moment, I think, was a real wake-up call for a lot of people. And I have my theories about why this was the moment that everyone sort of snapped into it and said, oh my gosh. But I think COVID and understanding the disparities in who was dying and who were the frontline workers and all of that stuff fed that. But watching the Jewish community, I have been doing like 1 to 2 webinars a week ever since. People have known about me for years. This is the first time that this has happened. So I think, wherever we are, I want to say, I hope it's an opening. I hope that our energy doesn't give out. This is a slog. This is like the long haul. And, just some of the things that we need to talk about as a community is how exactly that, that we're not in a Ziploc bag. What does it look like for a young Black man who is Jewish to show up to synagogue on a Saturday, where the police who make Jews who are not Black feel very safe? And I will say, as somebody who looks the way I do and worked in synagogues for 7.5 years, if I see a cop outside a synagogue, I feel safe. I own that. But what does that look like for a young Black man who might not be familiar to those police trying to go to synagogue? And I think of the man who was murdered by police, or sorry, who was shot and critically injured by police in Wisconsin yesterday, who was like breaking up a domestic dispute and somehow ended up shot. Or there was a guy who had run into an active shooter situation a couple of years ago in a mall in, I want to say Georgia, I forgot to look it up, and the police, when they showed up on site, assumed he was the active shooter and shot him dead. And you know, so for Black men showing up, these are like the ideas that are not ideas, the images that go through their heads. And so, you know, when we're trying to balance where we're at, I think these are all things that we need to think about really seriously as a community. And we'll have an opportunity to talk more towards the end in conversation between Kelly and I to sort of dive into that. I've talked longer than I intended to, so I'm going to toss it to Kelly now to talk more about DC specifically and some of the other issues.
Hi, yes, thank you all for being here. I appreciate everyone for tuning in and for putting in this work. A little about myself, as Marla mentioned, I am a rabbinical school student. I am very much a product of the Reform movement. I grew up going to a Reform synagogue, and I went to Reform summer camp, and I worked at a Reform synagogue, and I'm very proud of the movement, and I'm really proud to be a part of this movement that really highlights equality and equity and all these different types of social justice. And my, rabbis were being arrested for protesting against ICE and all these things that make me really proud to be a Jew. And at the same time, I'm walking around within my own community and feeling discriminated against and having microaggressions, which I'll go into later, and other forms of oppression, discrimination, slights that make me feel less than within my own community. So because of that, I would love to help make the community a better place, would love to give back and to really learn more. So for those reasons, I am in rabbinical school. I will be throwing some information at you now, definitions and historical facts, some of which might be uncomfortable. I encourage you to sit with this discomfort because from there comes growth. So according to the 2018 US Census Bureau, DC's population was about 45% Black. Now I'm going to go a little bit back. So in the 1950s and 60s, the Jewish community was active in the civil rights movement, and the Jewish Community Council, which is now the Jewish Community Relations Council, which brings us together today, they formally supported integration in 1953, which was a year before the National Brown versus Board of Ed decision. And the council worked with city and religious leaders to promote a peaceful transition to integration. In 1966, progressive Jews founded Jews for Urban Justice, which was a left-wing organization founded to oppose anti-Black racism within the Jewish community of Washington, D.C. Now, more nationally, 50% of freedom riders were Jews, and the civil rights legislation was written in the building of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism in DuPont Circle. And as Jews, I think we should be proud of our legacy for marching with King, for standing up, praying with our feet, marching for justice, but it does not let us off the hook from present day implicit bias. From past or present discrimination, not every Jew at the time was active in the civil rights movement for many different reasons, and this history does not let us off the hook from racism and other microaggressions. Jews fought discrimination because yes, it was morally the right thing to do, and God created us all b'tselem Elohim in God's image, and also because Jews themselves didn't want to be the target of hate groups, as we have been historically. Jews had to protect themselves, and maybe they thought one way of doing so was to protect discrimination on all levels. And as Jews, we became more upwardly mobile as the definition of whiteness expanded to include most of them. Jews benefited from white privilege, as they still do, many of them, which was their right. But because of their ability to benefit from the system, it's harder to fight against a system that you don't realize is in place when you're not the one being oppressed. Maybe some white Jews fail to recognize the structural barriers preventing Black people from doing better economically. And they began to push a kind of race-blind approach to society. With redlining and other forms of systematic oppression, Jewish white families were allowed to leave DC to move out into the suburbs, to eventually belong to country clubs and attend private schools which were off limits, maybe not formally, but culturally off limits to Black families. And they gain access to institutions and that allow for more privileged opportunities. Now, if Jews of color are approximately 7% of the DC area, and there needs to be more research done, it's complicated. Tema very greatly highlighted the discrepancies in counting Jews of color. If it's 7%, I don't always think it looks like it's 7%. And also, each generation is increasingly diverse. So I work with teens, I notice that I feel like it's more than 7%. But as you get older, or each generation that replaces the next will be increasingly diverse. But why are we not showing up at synagogues? It doesn't look like there are more Jews of color in our community. Is it because we're not engaging them? We're not reaching out to them? Or in my experience, it's because Jews of color do not feel as welcome. And this is not explicit. They're not redlining them out of the synagogues. In reality, it feels like it's because of microaggressions and other types of actions by Jews with the intent maybe to be welcoming or nice, but in reality have the impact that's hurtful. If you can throw up a slide that I have created with help of the Union for Reform Judaism's Audacious Hospitality team, great. Great. Okay, so microaggressions. A microaggression is the casual degradation of any marginalized group. Racial microaggressions are brief, commonplace, daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative. These are racial microaggressions, racial slights, and insults towards people of color. Next slide, please. So some examples of microaggressions that white Jews may face is, oh, you're Jewish? You don't have a big nose. Or, oh, you're Jewish, do you speak Jewish instead of being Hebrew? These are questions that remind us of our identity. They're othering us. Or, oh, so you're rich. I remember I was a part of this fellowship with other Jews, and I grew up working class, and someone even mentioned like, oh, we all have money, blah, blah, blah. And I remember being, wait, we all have money? Like, I thought that was a stereotype. I didn't realize that this is something that's commonly believed. And microaggressions are based off of stereotypes and other types of discrimination that, because of implicit bias, media, other forms of socialization, have been taught to us. Now, microaggressions can be seen as, the analogy could be death by 1,000 paper cuts. So every time someone comes up to you and says, oh, you don't look Jewish, paper cut. Or every time someone comes up to you and says, oh, how are you Jewish? Paper cut. And all of a sudden, I'm bleeding everywhere. Now, how am I supposed to be there for my community, advise my teens, give a devar, or even enjoy the cheese at Oneg if I'm bleeding? It's really hard for Jews of color, people of marginalized groups who also happen to be Jewish, to be present and be fully themselves in these settings when they're bleeding to death, when they're getting all these paper cuts. For me, as a student, as a rabbinical school student, it's hard for me to fully show up to my classes because I'm trying really hard to fit in, to hide the fact that I look different, which is really hard to do, especially over Zoom when we're all staring at each other at the same time. Next slide, please. Some comments and questions Jews of color commonly hear. So how are you Jewish? Many people are really curious to know like what my parental makeup is, if I was adopted, if I'm a Jew by choice. This is information that I am happy to volunteer once you get to know me. If the first thing you're saying to me when I walk in the door, or when you're trying to get to know me on this webinar, is they want to know how I'm Jewish, you don't ask these questions to white Jews. You're reminding me that I don't necessarily fit in. And notice that it's a delicate balance, because here I am talking about race, and I'm telling you, you can't ask me about race. That's because I'm volunteering this information. If you really want to know where I'm from, you can get to know me. First, you can ask, what kind of cheese is your favorite on this plate? Because the answer will always be brie. And that is the information that I'm happy to share. Telling me we don't look Jewish, or asking me what I am. Oh, you're not really Black, comparing people and assuming who they are. Or you're really smart or pretty for a Black, Asian, Latinx person. your voice sounds white, or I'm surprised you know so much about being Jewish, or the Torah. Just admitting that that Jews of color are not entitled to the same information as other Jews may have. Or one that is most common to me, especially at conferences, is, do you work here? Or other ways of expressing the assumption that a Jew of color is a custodial staff person rather than a member or a guest. Like I was an employee of the synagogue that I worked for, so I had a name tag, and people would assume at the synagogue multiple times that I was another Jew of color, or that I was a member of the custodial staff and hand me a plate, when in reality, you're handing me your plate, but I am the one who's your teen's advisor, you're there at the confirmation. Like, I'm also here to celebrate your child's success. While yes, a custodial staff member would do that, you're assuming based on the color of my skin that I have a different role. Tema, do you have anything to add to this slide? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just so many of these things that we all face. And I think, I have a really interesting experience because most people look at me and just assume that I am sort of Eastern European Ashkenazi. And a lot of what I experience is probably a little bit more on the macro lens, the macro end of aggressions, where people talk openly about race and Black people in ways that are frankly racist, not knowing that I'm there, or not knowing that they're talking about me, and when corrected or it's pointed out to them that I am mixed race, they come up with a bunch of questions like the ones that Kelly just sort of outlined. I've had numerous people remark on my hair over the years, which, again, I think a lot of the time they find out that I'm mixed, and then it's a whole other set of questions that I don't hear sort of Ashkenazi Jews asking other Ashkenazi Jews, and I should say white Ashkenazi Jews, about their hair in the same way, unless it's, the hair care product conversation, which we have all had with each other, which is a whole other thing. But, people generally speaking aren't asking to touch hair. Or, there was a moment that really sticks out to me where somebody found out from an article about Jews of color in Canada that I was mixed, and told me she happened to be South African, and told me, in an attempt to relate to me, that when she lived in South Africa, the Jewish women would straighten their hair so that they would not be confused with colored people during apartheid. So, really just the kinds of things that if somebody said about somebody who wasn't Jewish said about Jews, we would rightfully prickle, are the kinds of things that I hear, unfortunately, too much. The other sort of thing that I'll just highlight is also in the hurry to want to do things and like be active in fighting racism, there's just a lot of talking over what the needs of Jews of color actually is, and a lot of referring back to, well, we were so involved in the civil rights movement, therefore we can't be racist, not sort of fully understanding, first of all, that it wasn't the vast majority of the Jewish community that was active, just the people who were, that it was a large percentage of white people who were involved in civil rights activism, for good reason. And really that one has become extremely painful to hear. And I will say, like, I've got the picture of Heschel and Martin Luther King sitting above my desk, and it inspires me every single day. But it inspires me to act now, not sort of rest on the laurels of what happened some decades ago.
And I also think just because of, if we're talking about experiences of racism, this doesn't erase someone's personal experiences with anti-Semitism or our community's experience with anti-Semitism. We have to be able to hold these prejudices and these experiences at the same time, and one doesn't necessarily cancel out the other. Tema, you also brought up a good example of a microaggression where people try to relate to you with their experiences and say, oh, the same thing happened to me. But in reality, if you're a white person saying this to me, it isn't the same thing. While yes, you may have faced discrimination as being a young person or a woman or other times that you are a member of a marginalized group. Those things exist, but you have not experienced the same type of racism that I have, because we belong in North America to a society that is systemically racism. It is built in our heritage. It is built in our socialization, in every aspect of our life, both internally, intrinsically, systematically, interpersonally. It is all there. And because of that, it just is not the same. If you will move on to the next slide, please. So all of these microaggressions are like, maybe you're trying to get to know a person to make them feel welcome, which is a great thing. We want everybody to feel welcome in our community, but welcoming one is not the same thing as belonging. You can welcome someone with a welcome mat, but does that mean that you are sitting, that they feel like they're part of your community? The team I work with at Audacious Hospitality at the URJ loves to use this example to define diversity. So picture an oak tree and picture a desert. So here's a beautiful desert. There's lots of cacti and other deserty things. I've only lived on the East Coast. I'm not familiar with what actually happens in a desert, but I've watched movies. You can picture a desert, and that is a homogenous society. There are only cacti, and let's bring this oak tree into the desert. So now this oak tree is sitting in the desert, and bam, you have a diverse environment. However, the oak tree is dying. The oak tree does not have what it needs from its community to feel strong, to grow, to fit in. Instead, this oak tree is using all of its energy, being the only oak tree, to fit in. So yes, this community is diverse, but in reality, this oak tree, that one example of that makes your community diverse, is not doing well, is not feeling like maybe the cacti are welcoming the oak tree, but the oak tree doesn't really belong. So how do we fix that? In my opinion, one way to fix that is to unlearn these biases, to be aware and to talk about our whiteness or your whiteness, to understand that our systems need to be unlearned, and that's okay. It might be uncomfortable, but with that discomfort is really where we'll move on. Can you please go to the next slide? Thank you. So one step is to reconsider being colorblind. I know we love to use Martin Luther King's quote about, oh no, I don't want to misquote him, but an example that we're all the same, that you can't be racist because you treat everyone the same. Or growing up, I heard a lot, like, I don't care if you're black or white or green or blue or polka dotted, and racism is in the past. In reality, when you're, as I was mentioning earlier, when you're saying that racism is in the past and you're not seeing people, that's not very fair, because you're denying their experiences. So first you have to notice that I'm Black, and then you have to forget that I'm Black. That is also a quote that I will share once I remember who said it. So colorblindness is the racial ideology that posits the best way to end discrimination is by treating others as equally as possible. But in reality, it ignores the identities of who people are and what they've been through. It invalidates their experiences with racism. It makes us avoid talking about race when we need to talk about race and whiteness and Blackness and how it affects our society. It's in the air we breathe. We have no other option. There is no other air to breathe. And can we go to the next slide, please? So this is my last slide. Next slide after that. I already did that. Great. So what I recommend also is to be an upstander. So in school, or in examples of childhood, but I guess adulthood too, there's three people in a situation. There's the bully, there's the victim, and there's the bystander who's watching. And in school nowadays, when we're learning anti-bullying campaigns, kids are learning to be an upstander instead of a bystander. When you're witnessing bullying and aggression, to speak up, to interrupt, because it's not fair to stand idly by while someone's being hurt. You're not helping a person. If you're chumming up with the victim, with the bully. And I think the same lesson applies with working with teens and other adults in your community. If you're in white-only spaces, to advocate for your people of color. Or even if you don't know Jews of color, you should really make sure that if you do have them one day, that your community is welcome. I also believe that this is very situation based. For example, if someone goes to touch Tema's hair, and Tema is, I know that Tema will say, please don't do that, or Tema's not afraid to speak her mind. I know that I can leave it alone. But if it were happen to me, who I am an aggressive people pleaser, I will happily have someone do something, even if it makes me uncomfortable. I'm working on it. I'm in therapy. It's okay. We're trying to make that better. But Tema knows that I would feel really embarrassed if Tema called that person out in the moment. So because Tema knows me, Tema knows to pull Abby aside later and be like, Abby, when you touched Kelly's hair earlier, that was not the right thing to do. And this is because of the fixation on Black women's hair throughout history. And this is a conversation that we're having. So I wish I can offer you a script of what to do when you witness when you witness microaggressions, but in reality, it's very situation based. I also believe in interrupting. As Jews, I think we're really good at talking over each other, which is very hard on Zoom because you're all kind of muted at the same time. But that's okay. If you find someone is being aggressive, expressing bias, interrupt them. Try to prevent whatever damage has the potential to be done. That politeness or your comfort is not as important as someone else's safety in the room. So we have to push down our discomfort in order to protect the safety of people of marginalized communities. Create affinity spaces. So an affinity space, thank you, Tema. An affinity space is a space for people with similar interests or identities to come together. So for example, if you're at a conference, and this is, let's say, a conference for Jews, and we're talking, it's a Jewish knitting circle, and there's hundreds of people. It's the future when we can all be together again. And because I am walking around and people want to know where I'm from, or they're touching my hair, or I'm receiving all these other paper cuts as I'm going along, it can be really exhausting. And let's say in this knitting circle, there is a space, a room, a table at a meal that is just for Jews of color. And them at that space, as a person of a marginalized group, I can put my friends and I can put Band-Aids on each other. We can support our wounds. It has a big objection to affinity space is that it sounds a little bit like forced segregation, but we're not doing it for the purpose of pleasing white people. We're doing it in this example to protect our marginalized groups and give them a space to not be exhausted, to not do something called code switching, where you're trying to fit into these white Jewish spaces all the time. It gives them a chance to breathe. If in your Jewish communities, you're talking about race and you're talking about whiteness, it is hard, as Tema mentioned earlier, the great story where someone didn't realize that she was a person of color, and they were saying things that made Tema feel uncomfortable. And I think it's important for white people to be vulnerable, to talk about race, to hear each other out and to support each other, but it's not necessarily a safe or welcoming environment for people of color, because one, the person of color might be offended, and you don't want to create that type of conflict between people. And also it is a space where white people can say things that they're thinking and walk through those thoughts instead of internally processing them, often with a leader, someone that's helpful. Avoid a colorblind mentality, as I mentioned earlier. Avoid microaggressions and other forms of implicit and explicit bias. Avoid assumptions wherever somebody is coming from. Just don't base like, oh, because they have curly hair, that means they must have one Ashkenazi parent. Just no assumptions across the board. But have people volunteer information, get to know other things about them maybe before sharing about yourself, and use your voice. Interrupt. As a Jew of color, it's hard when it's all on me to help my school, to help my synagogue, to help other organizations. The more people I believe that are aware what a microaggression is, the more people who are aware of what the experiences of Jews of color, of non-binary Jews, of Jews with disabilities, of all different types of intersecting identities, the more that we make our spaces more equitable, not equal, equitable and inclusive, the less work it is for us, people of marginalized groups.
I'm just sitting here digesting a lot of what Kelly said, and one memory just popped up that I just want to share, which is about affinity spaces specifically. And it is exhausting. I was on probably year 8 of being a Jewish professional. I was always the only Jew of color on the staff of my organization. And I just wanted the time off to go to an affinity space. And it was not a priority for my organization to make that happen for me. And so there's and understandably, however, what gets missed and lost in that moment is that actually that's like the sustenance I need to keep going and keep doing the everyday work, not work about race or racism, just that when it's like, a fish out of water, is that like when you're the only one, there's never a day where you don't feel like the only one. And it's challenging because other people in our Jewish organizations don't share that experience. And again, coming back to the idea of defining Jews of color, that's where that sort of definition also is helpful to understand. It's the people who walk into spaces and see nobody like them regularly.
I'm also taking some moments just to digest everything, and there is so much information that has been shared over the last near 45 minutes, if that. I personally am a little overwhelmed, and I'm trying to go through some of these really powerful questions. Kelly, is there anything that you would like to sort of share as a follow-up to your presentation, or to Tema's response?
I'm not supposed to apologize, but I'm working on over apologizing. I'm thanking you for taking a moment to inhale all of this information, to maybe let's take a deep breath. I spit out a lot of information, so I want to thank you all for thinking critically and asking these deep questions. I think as far as how we can sorry, I just lost this question. Oh, I lost it. Yeah, I think a great way to ask a welcoming question at a Shabbat service is what brings you, not what brings you here, but like you can physically ask, how did you get here today? Did you enjoy the service? Is a great question. Just get to know the person, and not in a, it's a very hard balance. I wish there was a sheet that you can follow, but I would just recommend asking a Jew of color in your spaces the same questions you would ask a white Jew in your spaces. You don't need to know where a person came from. You don't need to know how they got their skin tone. The same way you don't ask a white presenting Jew if they're from an interfaith family, because I grew up in a white synagogue, and more than half of, or a very large percentage of the families were interfaith families. And people didn't ask, how are you Jewish? Because it was the norm that people came from different backgrounds.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And, I think some of the questions, when I think about it, so Rabbi Sandra Lawson, who's a dear friend and colleague, who I was on a webinar with her last week, and she said, one of the things that she has struggled with in Jewish spaces is people will ask her sort of an innocent question about, what brings you here or whatever, and she's just not in a place to answer it in a way that makes sense or anything like that. Or, is just trying to grab a bite at a conference or whatever it might be. And she says, like, now's not really the right time. And that she can always tell what the real intention of that question is. If the person is happy to sort of leave it and say, oh, sure, yeah, let's reconnect later. or aggressively continues to ask the question. One is curiosity and trying to place you in a context. The other is trying to make sure you belong. And it's really hard. And I think, the other thing that I will say is, some of the questions that we ask are the same questions that we would ask of a white presenting Jew who walks into a space that we've never seen before. But because the Black Jew has heard it every time they've walked into a space, they hear it differently. So this is always a challenge. Some of the ways that we can ask questions, and I will also say, like, we need to be okay with screwing up, and saying, I'm so sorry that question came out of my mouth in a way that hurt you. I was just, I had just hadn't seen you before and was wondering, if you were friends of the B'nai Mitzvah family or whatever it might be. So being comfortable to own it. And Callie was saying that she's trying to apologize less and not be an aggressive people pleaser. I jokingly say, like, as a Canadian, that's just like my default mode. Also just, not over apologizing as well. And I think really particularly, I noticed a question about going too far the other way. I remember one time that there was a Black woman who was coming to Toronto and wanted to go to synagogue, and she got in touch with me through one of the lists of synagogues that were like welcoming and friendly. And so I had to meet her, but I had to go somewhere first, so I was going to be late. She was totally comfortable in synagogue. She walked in, the usher handed her a prayer book. She went and sat down, totally fine. But the usher said to her the thing that the usher would say to everyone, which is, are you familiar with the prayer book? Because it was a Reconstructionist congregation. We were the only one in Toronto. Most of the time, if we had a guest, they were not familiar with the prayer book. And the woman thought nothing of it. She just said, yeah, I go to a Reconstructionist synagogue back home. Went into, and the usher, though, was horrified that she might have said something that made this guest feel like she was commenting on her race. So it's partially also learning to live with that balance of like understanding microaggressions, but not over analyzing everything that is out of your mouth, which ends up feeling like a different microaggression. Like, we're all human and we're going to make mistakes, but also the Black Jews walking into your spaces just like want to be there, and they don't necessarily want copious apologies if you think you might have transgressed in some way.
Yeah, I think I encourage this discomfort, this looking back on everything you say, like, oh, did I say the right thing? I think think about for white Jews and they're in a space and maybe they're handing out prayer books and wondering, oh, did I say the right thing to this person? This person has this interaction, maybe thinks about it, and then goes on with their day. I never go on with my day. I'm always a Black Jew. I got pulled over by the cops for the first time last week. Oh no, my mom's listening and I have not told her that yet. Speeding, I'm sorry. And oh no. And I, that fear that was in my chest because I had to have an interaction with the police in rural Massachusetts. Or when I'm in the grocery store and I'm with someone who's putting the stuff in their bag as they're shopping, like, don't do that. Like, that is how I end up being followed or how I end up getting in trouble. So maybe if you're thinking about, oh, am I going to say this right thing at Oneg for 10 minutes out of your whole week? I encourage that discomfort because I can't take off the color of my skin. I cannot deny my own identity. As far as what temples can do, I encourage them to hold sessions where they are learning about their own whiteness, where they're doing readings as group and discussing themselves, because this work needs to happen internally. We need to make the communities welcoming before we're reaching out for Jews of color, because as communities are becoming increasingly diverse, or as more Jews of color are coming into our spaces, whatever the future of the Jewish synagogues life looks like, I will not speak to that. I don't think anyone has the answer to that right now. But if your space is welcoming, if I'm going to walk in and I won't experience a single microaggression because the members of the board have done trainings, because the members of the board have read the podcast, listened to the podcast and read the material, then I'm going to like it there. And then I'm going to call up my cousin, or then I'm going to call up my friend, or the same way everyone else joins a synagogue. Like it's about the vibes and the community and finding a right match, or, you know, whatever, when you're looking for a neighborhood to live in, if you need to live near a synagogue. Like, it is about, you extend the membership by working on yourselves. Like, if you build it, they will come, sort of. Like, work within yourselves, and it's not about outreach. And it's also a hard balance between feeling tokenized and also having voices heard. If I know it's a large space, a large community, and I'm looking at a poster or an Instagram page, and I see the same kid of color, the same Black kid or whatever, and on every post, I'm gonna be like, okay, you are not diverse. You're trying to tokenize this one kid, or why are you interested in having me speak or rep your product?
Right. And just to add on that, you know, I think one of the things, because I would say of all of the synagogues I've spoken to over the years, 98% of them say we are not as diverse as we want to be. And, you know, how can we reach Jews of color, and how can we do this? And so on top of all of the things that Kelly has just mentioned, the do's and don'ts of this work, I always say also, like, be transparently aspirational. You know, don't necessarily put out the language of we're not as diverse as we want to be, which feels icky, but say something like, we aspire to be a community or a congregation, whatever language you want to use, where Jews of all races, sexual orientations, you know, family statuses, etc., are engaged and active participants of our community. So, you know, again, moving away from language of welcome, which you can throw out a welcome mat, but like, if there isn't a seat at the table, you don't really get in. But really, you know, being transparent about the fact that you're doing the work and putting out information on how that work is being done in your congregation. You know, I'm much more likely, if I'm traveling to a new city, for example, I'm much more likely to go to the synagogue that had the sermon about how Black Lives Matter the week after George Floyd was murdered than I am to go to one that didn't touch it at all. And so just understanding, you know, where I'm coming from as a human being, and sort of having that out there is a huge step in making this a more comfortable place for Jews of color of all kinds.
Thank you. So there are many questions that have come in, and I am not going to get to all of them. I already can tell you that. And so if your question isn't answered, or if you feel as though your question has been lumped in or misrepresented in some way, you can always feel free to follow up with me, and we can talk it out and see where that question is coming from, how we can understand it, and what we can do to continue our learning together. As well as in the chat box, I included the link for JCRC's toolkit, Listen, Learn, Act, and I encourage you to check out the resources that are in there. So I'm going to look at some of these questions. They're on a second screen here, so let me bring things over. I'm finding a couple different topics. There's the question of engagement. I see a lot of questions that are coming in about, so what should we do? And I think that Kelly and Tema, you've touched on that a lot. What should we do? What shouldn't we do? What would you say are 2 to 3 things that are, let's just 2 things, our institutions, our synagogues, our camps, our schools, we're leading up to the holidays, everything's starting up again in some way, shape, or form. What are 2 things that we could do right now that will make a difference? It's a little bit on the spot, but if you have them, or if you want to think, like, what are 2 things that you can take going forward?
If I were, one thing I would do that is immediate right now is I would consider checking where your monthly tzedakah, where your donations are going. Are your donations going to Black organizations? Are they going to bailout funds? Are they going to organizations that support your local Black community, the national Black community, or other organizations that help members of marginalized groups. That is a immediate action, or you can drop $5, for example, at specific organizations. That is number one. Tema, you can share one as well.
I have so many. I don't even know
I
where
know.
to start. But I think for me, the biggest thing, and one of the things that I always talk about on this, is that we cannot do any of this work. And when I say we, I'm using like the royal we, the Jewish community, unless we are willing to sit with really hard truths about ourselves. And, you know, how even the Jews of color amongst us are complicit in maintaining structures in the Jewish community that exclude us because we have jobs in organizations where our friends and family don't necessarily feel comfortable. I'm not speaking from my own personal experience in this case. I've been fortunate, but other professionals that I've spoken to over the years, and other people, you know, have had that experience of, you know, we're part of the structure of and fabric of Jewish life. So I just say that just to be really clear. I'm not like throwing this all out and saying like, and it's all, you know, listen to us as well when we say like, here are the things and here are the ways. So I think listening to the Jews of color amongst us is a big one. That's not actually the one that I want to give you. The one that I want to give you is sit with the hard truths. Take a look and look at how many Jews of color are in your community. Look at your lives, your personal lives. And I'm going to give a concrete example. I moved about a month ago, but before I moved, I was in the neighborhood where my synagogue was located. So we drew heavily on people in the neighborhood. There was about a 7-minute walk from me, the subway station. And then on the other side of the subway station was Little Jamaica. You know, historic Black community in Toronto, tons of fantastic food, you know, really great place, like bookshops and cultural centers and all of this stuff. But, you know, not necessarily, I won't say it was a dangerous neighborhood, but it's not a neighborhood I would walk alone at night necessarily. However, when early on in this, I was talking and said, you know, support Black businesses. I was talking to a group from my synagogue, and they said to me, well, where are they? And we're talking about like 1.5 miles from where we were sitting at the, well, it was Zoom because of COVID, but where we were mostly sitting at that moment, that people did not realize that within 2 miles of where we lived was a vibrant Black community. And so our lives, for the most part, are extremely segregated. You know, I saw a number of questions come in the box talking about, have I experienced anti-Semitism in Black communities? The reality is, because my work is in the Jewish world, and, you know, my community is in the Jewish world, and most of my volunteerism is in the Jewish world, most of the Black people I regularly associate with are Jews. And my family is very respectful and excited about my Jewish journey. So, you know, that hasn't been my experience. Also Canadian, it's predominantly Caribbean, like it's a very different context. But, you know, even my life, when I look at it, and I am somebody who goes to the Black neighborhood to get food or to go to a poetry reading, you know, I go to Black caucus meetings of our provincial political party, like I'm very involved in those ways. My day-to-day life still is majority white Jewish. And that's just the reality of how our societies are structured. And so really spending time to parse that and start to push ourselves on our out of our comfort zone. And I don't mean like go up to a Black person and be like, can we be friends? That's not at all what I mean. I mean just sort of expanding our horizons to understand, like, here are my blind spots because of the way that my day-to-day life is structured.
There's a phrase that was used by the disability rights movement, nothing about us without us. And I think that if you're going to be having these conversations within your community, which I recommend that you do, I would, or you're leading panels or whatever it is, I recommend that you either if you have a close relationship with Jews of color in your community, that you reach out to them and build a program from there, or if you don't, reach out to other Jews of color who, like Tema and I, are more familiar with understanding how to become an anti-racist congregation, or reaching out to people outside the community as consultants when you're trying to become more welcoming. I will pull back up, as someone shared, I think at Temple Sinai in Washington, D.C. does a good job at looking at themselves and has an ongoing program called Multiracial Sinai that is on the Temple Sinai DC website. I'm happy to share a link. And with that, that congregation affirms their commitment to being anti-racist. They dismantle racism within the institution, supports Black congregants, and they're having a discussion group every week. They're reading, they're learning their own whiteness. And I think that is the second thing that you can do right now is, one, donate, that was mine, and two, research, look around and see make it a priority, how you can make your own communities better. Figure out what's out there, and then from there, long-term build.
Okay, so I have a few more questions. Once again, looking through some of the themes that are popping up, and one of the questions that has come up in a few different ways is about security. So you started to mention security while you were speaking. I believe, Tema, you brought it up. And I know, Kelly, you touched on it in how do you belong here, and who's the insider, who's the outsider conversation. And that still seems to be something that is very difficult, and something that I hope that JCRC can be involved in, having those broader conversations within the Jewish community in this area. Actually, I have a call scheduled later this week with someone from security program to talk about this, because it's a real issue. So what do you feel are some of the things that are there? And we talk about the question of I think in listening to Carly Pildes, one of our board members, activist, writer, talk about what it means when police cars are parked outside of a synagogue. And when I see a police car parked outside of a synagogue as a white Ashkenazi woman, I'm thinking, okay, well, they're here to protect me. But how is that experience? How might that experience be different for a Jew of color? And then there's that other layer of how is that also different within gender, and how does that play out, especially as Black men in this country do feel don't always feel safe with the police.
So one thing I will say is I think Black men are definitely more at risk from the police, but I don't think Black women feel any less unsafe, any more safe. You get what I'm trying to go with that double negative. Anyhow, so I think just want to sort of point that out. And I think this is a really real tension that is going to take extremely hard work to work through. And I say this as somebody who spent, now I work from a corner of my apartment, but I spent close to 12 years working in Jewish communal organizations that had all the government funding for bulletproof glass. And the reality is that our institutions are at risk. And that is a very real fact and a very real threat. And I've been in the unfortunate position, I will say, as a synagogue staffer, that I had to, we had a dignitary, and so there was police everywhere, and there was an unfamiliar person that made a volunteer feel uncomfortable. She came to me. I couldn't assess the situation. I had to go to the police and have the police talk to the one Black person in the building, who turned out to be an invited guest of the dignitary. Very uncomfortable situation. Fortunately, in that moment, I'm just sharing this story because it's so, when I talk about how we all play into the structures, I had no choice but to approach the police in this situation because of my position, and the person who happened to be at our, I think it actually was the day the prime minister was there. Like, it was like that level. It was either the prime minister or the consul general of Israel. It was like, you know, there was no choice in this moment. And I was very fortunate that somebody who does anti-racism work in Toronto happened to be right there. And after talking to the police, I pulled her aside and sobbed. And I'm getting like misty-eyed just thinking about it. And the reality is that because there are threats to our communal organizations, security is a very serious concern. At the same time, I encourage us all to imagine how we would feel if the police killed a young Black Jewish man walking into our building because they thought he was a threat. And, you know, God forbid that we ever have to live that moment. And, you know, just thinking about thinking about it that way, I think puts it into stark relief what we're talking about here. And I wish I had an easy answer. You know, there are some of like the sort of solution focused answers, like make sure that, you know, if you can hire, ensure that you have Black police officers who are there, let them know that Black people come to your synagogue, like all of that sort of stuff, just to sort of normalize that seeing a young Black man walking in isn't like out of the ordinary. You know, work with, make sure that they have anti-bias training, like all of this sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, we have a really huge tension between the security of the majority or the feelings of security of the majority and the real threat to a minority of our community. And, you know, we need to come up with a situation where we don't just perpetuate a system that leaves part of the community that we really want to bring in and hold close feeling threatened. I wish I had an easy answer for you. I do not.
I think as we enter Elul and prepare ourselves for the high holidays, that we're really at an interesting point, specifically for many communities who are gathering virtually in spaces that at once had a police officer out front. And it feels that because there is no longer a police officer out front, or strangers, even though I would be at the synagogue 5, 6, 7 teen advisor days a week, when there were extra people there who were not part of the weekly, daily crowd, which is great, it makes me feel less than, and I feel more eyes on me, and that was not a great experience. I think as we're online, more Jews of color will maybe feel more likely to join. And I think that means that cops in the front of synagogues do send a message that the well-being of some is more important than the well-being of others. I noticed that when we had terrible instances of anti-Semitism within our community, violent acts, those aggressors, those people who went in with guns, are not Black. And these are the people who, and yet Black people are being stopped. Like Tema had to go to a Black person because a white person felt uncomfortable. If you want to maintain security and safety in your synagogue, I would not actually recommend keeping a police officer. I recommend actually using a member of your community. And as you walk in, you have to question everyone on the high holidays. If we're back, have everyone show ID and tickets, not just people who look suspicious. Even if they're people you've known your entire life, question them for their identity. If that makes you uncomfortable for 5 minutes, that is so much, or 30 seconds, that is a lot better than having to be a person of color in the community feeling uncomfortable the entire time they're in your building. If synagogues, Jewish spaces, schools, those are there so you can be in touch with your spirituality. Or whatever reason that you're going to the spaces, that's personal. When you have to be on edge, that you're being stared at, you can't fully pray. You can't fully be there. I love the idea of building community. I don't want to bring people together if I'm worried that I'm being stared at. I really encourage this time of year and all times of year that heshbon nefesh, this soul searching that is important to figure out what exactly you are doing and at what point you're putting your comfort over the safety of others.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, you know, I was very lucky that we were in a position, and again, I have the fortune of sitting in Canada where we have very different gun laws, and I want to name that. Yeah, we had the fortune that instead of hiring uniformed police, which a number of synagogues do, my former executive director, who passed away a couple of years ago, may his memory be for a blessing, hired off-duty firefighters in their ceremonial uniform. So they knew what to do in an emergency. They knew what to do in a security emergency. But, you know, it was generally speaking like these kind of older gentlemanly people who were like helping the seniors in and checking everyone's bags and tickets, and they checked everyone. I walked in wearing my like badge, and they checked my bag and looked at my ticket. And part of it was what we told them to do, which was, you know, even if the usher standing next to you says, oh, it's okay, you need to see the ticket. And if they don't have one, you need to send them to the ticketing office. But also it was removing it from a security sort of lens and putting it into a safety and hospitality lens. So it was less about securing the people inside and more about making sure that we were all physically and emotionally safe. And it worked fantastically. Again, Canada, we have a lot less guns around. However, I will say we have a serious white nationalism problem in this country, like extremely serious. You can look it up if you're interested. Like it's really, really bad. And so there are risks. And the reality is that there also are guns. And we have managed to make it safe for the most part for the Jewish community and make it comfortable for Black Jews to walk into some of our largest synagogues.
That's, thank you. It's such a fascinating point of how do we shift the conversation to hospitality from safety and security. I think that has something to do with how we welcome versus like who are we trying to bring in, who are we trying to keep out, and how we shift our understanding of that framework. I know I've thought about, you know, I will always make sure that I am opening up my my talit bag and opening up my, you know, my items when I'm walking into shul, when I'm walking into synagogue, because I want my children who are white to know that they need to do that, and it's their privilege not to in a lot of ways, and that they need to do it because their friends who are Jews of color will not get the same privilege. So I think it's very important that we're instructing not just, you know, the adults on the call here today, but the teens that Kelly works with and the kids that are in our early childhood centers and our Hebrew schools, that we're having these conversations with them as well. And what better way to do that than as people are walking into our institutions on a regular basis. I'm noticing that we have about 5 minutes left. There are so many wonderful questions that have come in, and so many of them that really can't be discussed in 5 minutes. I do want to pull out one though that is probably a longer conversation. So the question comes in, when you're in settings with persons of color who aren't Jewish, have you experienced questions about your background similar to the microaggressions within the Jewish community? I know, Kelly, you started to talk a little bit about the intersectionality of racism and anti-Semitism, and how that's, you know, how that impacts, but and some of the code switching that goes on. But what are some of the takeaways to help us understand that conversation?
I would actually, if I understand the question correctly, which is like about other discrimination or uncomfortable conversations within other communities, that's the question, right? Like how like if we experience anti-Semitism in like Black communities?
So I believe the question is, how do you handle that? How do you handle that intersectionality? And when the microaggressions are about Jews, and I think it actually speaks a lot to the current moment of what does it mean that Black Jews, and I've seen this in different Facebook groups, I think Black Jews feeling pulled between two spaces at this time.
I would love to respectfully push back on this question. I am worried. I think that with the last 5 minutes, it would be great if we can continue talking about making the Jewish community more inclusive and not draw attention from this conversation to like showing the flaws in the Black community. And I do agree that anti-Semitism is an issue across the board. I just don't think it's appropriate at this time to highlight that. I think it's an interesting question, but maybe for another time.
And one thing I'll just add to that is that a number of Black Jews have written on it sort of endlessly between Facebook and Twitter. It's a pain point for us, which I think is why, Kelly and I both probably would rather focus on the topic, which is how to make us feel as at home as possible in the Jewish community, and let us continue to do the hard work that we do working in Black communities as well.
No problem. And thank you, actually, for calling me out on that. And I guess
we're calling
me in because I asked the question, and I really appreciate how you reframed it and how you pushed it back as, no, the conversation right now is about our communities and the internal work. So thank you. I appreciate that. So let me, goodness, we only have like 2 minutes left. And I don't want to jump into something that's going to be much larger that we're not going to be able to fully respond to. So I would like to give you the last words. I think that's an important, I think that's important that your stories, your voices close us out. So Tema, Kelly, go for it.
Every time I have one of these conversations, which is a lot lately, I'm just left with sort of wanting to say to everyone who is here listening and everyone who will listen later, please let this just be an opening. This is something that I'm turning 37 in a month. I have 37 years of living with this. So it's not something that can ever be distilled to an hour and a half. I'm grateful in a way. I wish I didn't have to feel gratitude, but I do. I feel really true gratitude at the fact that for some reason over the last 3 months, the Jewish community said, whoa, we got to talk about this everywhere. Every Jewish organization is getting in touch, and it's amazing. And it's been a wild ride getting to this moment, let me tell you. So let this be an opening. There is no way to talk about everything, much less the context and history. Like, that's already a 5-week discussion. So please just reach out to Abby for more resources. You can find all of my writing on my website. I'm really easy to find. It's just myname.com. And just keep learning and keep engaging and keep trying, and we'll get there bit by bit.
Yeah, I think listen to the sound of the shofar this month. Let that be a call to awaken the soul, to start the spiritual accounting that happens throughout this month, and let that lead you into the days of awe. Let us reflect personally on our actions of the year and seek forgiveness for those who have wronged us in ways that we've missed the mark. And also let it be a start for growth, for that discomfort that we talked about, for learning from our mistakes, apologizing for them, And moving on, let us pay people of color for their time. And reach out to, I don't have a website, but I do have an email and a Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever you use to stay in touch, preferably not on TikTok, but where I really encourage this Heshbon Nefesh.
Thank you both for your time, for your wisdom, for the emotional energy that this webinar takes, for calling me out when I mess up. I deeply appreciate that. And on behalf of my colleagues here at JCRC of Greater Washington, I thank everyone who's participated for your questions and for your interest. Feel free to reach out and to be in touch with us for more information and for more ways that we can continue this conversation. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.